Chapter 6 Hegel and Derrida. No one who has even a passing familiarity with Derrida's work will be surprised if we feel compelled to modify his comment immediately, for no matter what we may take, we will scarcely be able to induce the inventor of deconstruction to make any direct statements on the matter of the pyramid. In the age of discourse analysis, as we know, any kind of directness has been abolished. A very wide range of authors have adopted the custom of not speaking or writing about a matter in their own voices, but rather via other authors who have spoken or written about the matter. And I am also one of these people. The observing of observations and describing of descriptions characterizes a period that has turned the necessity of coming too late into the virtue of second-order observation in all areas. Someone regarding these logical games with a malicious eye could easily suspect that they show the nihilistic mediocrity of the commentators taking revenge on the genius of the authors of primary texts. Such a suspicion becomes unfounded, however, as soon as the first author is Hegel and the second is Derrida. Yeah, it's impossible if you're going to be talking about these great thinkers not to go through many mediations. So if Hegel had been willing to make any first-order statements on the subject of the pyramid, we would have had an opportunity to hear indirectly Derrida's thoughts on the matter. With a constellation of this level, one can speak once again an inter-Hegelian relationship, and even if it does not have the appeal of a direct encounter, if none the less shows the characteristics of a key scene. With the scene in view, we have become third-order observers. It's funny how Sloterdijk calls himself a third-order observer. That's crazy. Okay? And as such, witnesses of a dramatic operation. If Sloterdijk is a third-order observer, then I'm like a 100th-order observer. And as such, witness of a dramatic operation. It is like the final session of a drawn-out psychoanalytical treatment in which the last pharaoh of metaphysics is treated by its last Joseph, where Hegel is the pharaoh and Derrida is Joseph. Derrida sits down silently behind Hegel, as is the custom, and allows the latter's monologue to unfold. Naturally, the philosopher does not speak lying down, but rather standing at the pulpit of his university in Berlin, delivering the encyclopedia of philosophical sciences at the peak of conceptual power, bending slightly forward to do justice to his manuscript and the gravity of the matter. The deconstructionist analyst initially does anything except listen to the metaphors, the leaps, the gaps, and slips of the tongue which possibly reveal motives at work in this transmission of complete knowledge that sabotage its full closure from within. Suddenly the tension mounts. Hegel has just begun to speak about the functions of signs in the movement of the idea's return to self-presence. We are in the middle of the paragraph on the theory of the imagination or general fantasiology, an important chapter in the discourse about the subjective spirit. Again, we return to the subject. While Hegel is speaking, we see that Derrida, who had been listening motionlessly until now, is beginning to take notes. We can read these in the volume Margins of Philosophy, where they were published under the title The Pit and the Pyramid, Introduction to Hegel's Semiology. It immediately becomes clear the fate of deconstruction will be decided in this scene. For when Derrida showed in his early studies on Husserl how writing clouds the diaphanous entente cordiale between the voice and the phenomenon. He had to clear the highest hurdle in the confrontation with Hegel in order to demonstrate how the materiality, differentiality, temporality, and externality of signs obstructs the idea's return to complete self-ownership. It does not require much effort for Derrida to show that Hegel's semiology is platonically inspired. If signs have a sense, it is because their spiritual side equals a soul that inhabits a body, or which, as Derrida states with revealing caution, is deposited within a body. The inert body of the signifier is animated by the intention of the signified, so to speak. This animation is nonetheless assigned a strict limit because even if the living soul is present within it, the sign as such remains irredeemably dead. The sign is a place in which the living directly encounters the dead without the dead ceasing to be dead or the living ceasing to live, albeit in a mortified form, namely as a post-mortal soul, which asserts its primacy over the external material through presence in the foreign. Thus the familiar schema soma sema returns. The body, in keeping with the eternal refrain of Platonism, in the monument of the soul. If signs are monuments in which immortalized living souls reside, however, then one can see the pharaonic grave, the pyramid, as the sign of all signs. Hegel does not hesitate for a moment in drawing this conclusion. Semiology would then, in a certain sense, only be possible as a generic science of pyramids. Every encyclopedia would contain nothing but the avenues of vocal pyramids together with the written signs in which the ever-living signifieds are preserved, bearing witness to the hegemony of the buried breath over its shell with every single entry. Every sign, according to Hegel, is the pyramid into which a foreign soul has been conveyed and is preserved. 458 in the encyclopedia. This decisive aspect here is that Hegel does not merely introduce the doctrine of the arbitrariness of signs that will later become the trademark of Saussure. This doctrine also takes on a philosophical motivation, for only through the random choice of signs does the freedom of the spirit come to power, in contrast to the heteronomy of symbols and symptoms. From this perspective, it is not difficult to see why Hegel's interest in signs moves in a direction leading as far away as possible from Egyptianism. If he is to bring his theory of the spirit to its goal, he cannot waste any time with the weight of the pyramids or the enigmatic nature of the hieroglyphs. Both must be overcome until the spirit can clothe itself in a shell of language whose lightness and translucence allow it to forget that it requires any external addition. This permission to forget is not a mistake. It testifies to the creation of a language that is sufficiently light and diaphanous to avoid placing any obstacles in the path of the idea as it returns to itself from without. In this sense, the Egyptians remain eternal prisoners of externality to Hegel, like the Chinese, thank you, whose language and writing from one giant system of barriers and disturbances that renders impossible the fulfilled moment in which the spirit, distantly attendant on itself, hears itself speak. Amazing, right? The Egyptians and the Chinese are totally outside of this. And this is why I focus on this Egyptian reading right now because I've spent a lot of time focused on the Chinese faraway peripheral, the other external faraway peripheral, for the help of our own decolonization, for the help of our own healing of historical trauma, is the Egyptianism, let's say. It is unnecessary to show here how deconstruction treats these claims in detail. The basic operation of the third dream interpretation, third dream being the second dream was Freud and the first was Joseph and the third being Derrida, is clear enough. It consists in using minimally invasive gestures to relate the text of metaphysics to the inner dream adrift. So here, where Sloterdijk points to gestures, I point to ritual. Gesture and ritual. And that's why I think that the handshake is the most important object of study today in order to bring people into a collective public sphere. The handshake is the ultimate and the oldest form of communion. And we can look to the Chinese form of handshake and compare it to the Western form of handshake. And there we can find true emancipation in the gesture, in the handshake. I'm going to go back to the text. Okay. The basic operation of the third dream interpretation is clear enough. It consists in using minimally invasive gestures to relate the text of metaphysics, and I would call it ontotheology, to its inner dream adrift, the delirium of unimpeded self-appropriation, and shows its inevitable failure. It is sufficient if it proves the impediment that hinders this fulfillment fantasy. Therefore, Derrida must develop a passionate interest in the ancient pyramid, for it constitutes the archetype of the cumbersome objects that cannot be taken along by the spirit on its return to itself. But even Hegel, the thinker in the age of light and seemingly surmountable science, suffers the fate of being hindered in his final closure of the circle by a cumbersome obstacle. Even if the spirit's path through the cultures equals a circular exodus on which excessively heavy objects are left behind until the wandering spirit is sufficiently light, reflexive, and transparent to feel ready to return to the start, there is one printed book left that, despite its handiness, referring to Heidegger, still possesses too much externality and contrariness to be passed over entirely. Even as a paperback, the phenomenology of spirit is still an inert and opaque thing that denies its own content. As soon as someone points their finger at its cover and black letters, the celebration is spoiled for good. Even the pyramid, however, will not be interesting to Derrida as the dead king within it, as he is the only subject whose dreams are truly worth interpreting. One could even go so far as to say that a form of complicity, this is what's called when you take on really the carrying the burdens, right? Carrying the burdens is all about decolonizing, is all about really, truly taking on the concept of complicity and incomprehensibility and incommensurability to task. And what's crazy about this phenomenon, the world that we live in now, is just the pseudo-intellectualism. And Butler calls it anti-intellectualism. Oh my goodness. Okay. No, the people are smart. Okay, they can recognize bullshit. And they do. They recognize bullshit. They recognize the propaganda that's coming out of the universities today. One could even go so far as to say that a form of complicity comes about between the king and his dream interpreter. For in order to decipher the king's dreams, the interpreter must be able to dream them himself to a certain extent. Although his main profession is the resistance to Pharaonism and its politics of immortality, the deconstructionist philosopher is in constant danger of falling in love with the objects of deconstruction. This is the counter-transference in the post-metaphysical rapport. As a reading intelligence, he is the victim of his receptivity, just as Socrates was the victim of the Athenians' gossip, which he absorbed into the breadth of his ability to listen. This is the point of the philosopher today. He has to sacrifice himself. He has to sacrifice his social capital so that he can actually critique the bullshit. Just as Socrates was the victim of the Athenian gossip, which he absorbed into the breadth of his ability to listen. Amazing. When the people of Athens assembled for discussion in the agora, the ear of Socrates was the agora, in the agora. It is no coincidence that in one of Derrida's most brilliant essays contributed to Festschrift in honor of Jean-Pierre Vernant under the title Cora, he says the following about the proto-philosopher. Socrates is not Cora, the chorus, I guess. But if it were someone or something, he would resemble it very strongly. This bon mot contains thinly veiled Derrida's self-portrait. He characterizes the Cora as a form of vessel without qualities, able and entitled to understand everything and hence absorb everything, as we are doing precisely here. The Cora is the ghosts, are all the ghosts. It is permitted for the deliriums of the oldest pyramid builders to be absorbed into the comprehending soul of the deconstructionist, for there is nothing that cannot find a space, maybe even its rightful place, within the receptive breadth. As a radical partisan of non-one-sidedness, Derrida wanted to call the dream constructs of the immortalists to order through the reason of mortality. With his reminder of the politics of immortality, however, he also corrected the blind mortalism of merely pragmatic reason. Ooh. We are still in search of convincing evidence that Derrida himself was aware of the continuity through which the pyramid as a real estate venture remained connected to the Jewish project of giving God a mobile format. We find some proof in a passage from Derrida's Mediation on the pit and the pyramid, in which the author suddenly plunges into a dizzying speculation that goes beyond the context. He was just expounded Hegel's theory of the imagination as memory, which states through the intelligence is like a pit, leading vertically in the depths of the manor or a well or a mine, at whose bottom images and the voice of one's life are unconsciously preserved. From this perspective, the intelligence is a subterranean archive in which the traces of things past are stored like inscriptions before writing. Derrida suddenly says something very surprising about this. A path, which we will follow, leads from this night pit, silent as death and resonating with all the powers of the voice which it holds in reserve, to a pyramid brought back from the Egyptian desert, which will soon be raised over the sober and abstract weave of the Hegelian text. The Pit and the Pyramid by Derrida, page 77. What is conspicuous here is that the reference to the pyramid brought back from Egypt. The phrase is all the more expressive for bringing scarcely motivated by the context. It intrudes upon the development of the argument like a personal declaration. It proves that Derrida thought of the pyramid as a transportable form, and the secret of this transportability undoubtedly lies in the lightening through textualization. But Derrida does not stop at this proof of the idea that not only the one God, but also the Egyptian tomb sets off on a journey. He now takes the risk of presenting the dream factory of metaphysics in an image of extreme pathos. Here, as he remarks, lies a riddle that demands to be solved, namely, that the path still remains circular, that the pyramid becomes once again the pit that it always will have been. How does Derrida know this? What is his statement that there is a way from the pit to the pyramid and back again based on? On the assumption that metaphysics as a whole, known after Heidegger as ontotheology, took this very path itself. For what was metaphysics if not the continuation of pyramid building with the logical and scriptural means of the Greeks and Germans? Through this suggestion, which can claim the status of lucid phantasm, the philosopher implies that there is a single possibility of deconstructing the otherwise undeconstructible pyramid by transporting it back along the entire route it has taken on the trail of textuality, from Cairo to Berlin via Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome. One only has to distort it long enough until it changes back into the pyramid that it initially was. This pit expresses the fact that human life, as such, is always survival from the start. It fundamentally possesses the form of self-recollection. Existing in this moment means having survived oneself up to that point. At every moment in which it reflects upon itself, life stands at its own sepulcher. A sepulcher is the small room or monument where you pay homage to the ancestors or to the dead people, or where you store the dead people. Remembering itself at its own sepulcher, remembering itself, while the voices of its own beingness, having beingness, sound from the depths. Whoever comprehends this understands what it means to interrogate the ghosts of the pharaoh into the sphere of brotherliness. One can easily imagine Derrida visiting Egypt and reciting Baudelaire's line, Mon semble, mon frère, at the eradicated monument to Amenhotep IV.